The first pale threads of dawn had yet to touch the Montana sky when Thomas Wade heard the soft nickering of horses outside his weathered barn. He lay perfectly still in the hay loft, his 68-year-old frame stretched across the old horse blankets he used for a bed during calving season. To any observer, the silver-bearded rancher appeared to be sleeping deeply, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of an old man lost in dreams. But Tom Wade was not sleeping. Behind closed eyelids, his pale blue eyes tracked every sound, every whisper carried on the pre-dawn wind. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of rope work and harder things, remained relaxed at his sides even as his mind cataloged each detail filtering through the barn walls. For horses, maybe 5. The soft creak of leather suggested experienced riders who knew how to move quietly. One horse favored its left front hoof, probably the bay mare he had noticed watching his property for the past 3 days. Another rider shifted constantly in his saddle, nervous energy that marked him as young and inexperienced. The whispered voices confirmed what Tom had suspected for weeks. They thought him an easy mark, a lone old man with a small herd and no family to protect him. The Crimson Creek gang had been terrorizing the valley for months, and now they had come for his cattle. Big Jake Morrison, the gang leader, spoke in hushed tones that barely carried through the barn wood. Tom had seen Morrison in town, a barrel-chested man with cruel eyes who wore his reputation like a badge. The outlaw believed himself untouchable, protected by 6 loyal men and the fear he had cultivated throughout 3 counties. Listen to that, Tom thought as Morrison's gravelly voice drifted closer. The man was actually giving orders, dividing up the work like this was any other job. Move the cattle quiet-like toward the north pasture. Circle around the water tank. Keep that old bull calm, or he will wake the whole valley. Tom almost smiled at that. They thought Hercules, his 12-year-old longhorn bull, was the biggest threat they would face tonight. Snake-Eye Briggs, Morrison's lieutenant, chuckled softly as he positioned his horse near the barn door. Sleeping like a baby in there, he whispered to his companions, probably dreaming about better days when he could still throw a rope without falling off his horse. The other gang members joined in the quiet mockery. Dirty Pete Kowalski mentioned something about the old man's shaking hands, how he had seen Tom fumble with his coffee cup in town just last week. What they did not know was that Tom had been watching them watch him, playing the role of a feeble old rancher while gathering intelligence on their movements and capabilities. Through it all, Tom remained motionless, his breathing steady and natural. This ability to lie still and observe had saved his life more times than he could count during his 40 years as a lawman. Patience was a weapon most men never learned to use properly. The soft lowing of cattle told him they had begun the gather. 47 head, his entire herd except for Hercules and 2 pregnant heifers he kept in the paddock near the house. It represented 3 years of careful breeding and every dollar he had managed to save since hanging up his badge. These men were not just stealing his cattle. They were stealing his future, his chance at the peaceful retirement he had promised his late wife Martha. Speaking of theft and injustice, if you are listening from somewhere in this great country of ours, I would love to hear where this story finds you. Drop a comment about what state or country you are tuning in from. These tales of frontier justice seem to resonate everywhere people understand the difference between right and wrong, and I am always amazed at how far these stories travel. As the cattle sounds grew more distant, Tom finally opened his eyes. The barn remained dark, but his vision had adjusted hours ago. Every detail stood out clearly, from the rusted pitchfork leaning against the wall to the old harness hanging from its peg. This barn had been his sanctuary since Martha passed 2 years ago, a place where he could think and remember without the empty house pressing down on him. But tonight it had served a different purpose. Tonight it had been his observation post. Tom rose slowly, making the small sounds an old man would make after sleeping in a hayloft. His joints protested with genuine stiffness, but his mind remained sharp and focused. He moved to the small window facing north and watched the dark shapes of his stolen cattle disappearing into the distance, driven by men who thought they had committed the perfect crime. They had no idea who they had just robbed. Tom climbed down from the loft and walked to the far corner where he kept his gear hidden beneath loose hay and old horse blankets. His fingers found the familiar weight of his Colt Peacemaker, the .45 caliber revolver that had been his companion for 4 decades. The weapon showed its age, the blue-black finish worn smooth in places, but Tom maintained it with the devotion other men reserved for their prayers. Carved into the walnut grip were the initials M.W., put there by his beloved Martha on their wedding day 39 years ago. She had insisted that part of her would always ride with him, protecting him when she could not. Tom ran his thumb across those letters now, feeling the familiar mixture of love and loss that never quite faded. Beneath the revolver lay his other treasures. A Winchester rifle with a scope he had purchased in Denver 3 years before his retirement. A box of hand-loaded cartridges, each round crafted with the precision of a watchmaker. And wrapped in oiled leather, the 5-point star that had defined his life for so long. The Texas Ranger badge caught what little starlight filtered through the barn window, its silver surface reflecting decades of service in the pursuit of justice. Tom had carried that badge through Indian Territory, across the Panhandle during the cattle wars, and into towns where his reputation preceded him like a winter storm. He had pinned it on every morning for 40 years, and even now, 2 years into retirement, his chest felt incomplete without its familiar weight. Tom Wade, they used to call him. Just Tom Wade, because no other identifier was needed. In 3 territories and 2 states, that name carried weight enough to stop conversations and empty saloons. Men who had never met him knew the stories, and men who had met him rarely forgot the encounter. But that was the past, and Tom had worked hard to leave it buried with his wife and his younger self. He had come to Montana seeking peace, hoping to build something gentle with his remaining years. The cattle had been his attempt at a new kind of life, one measured in seasons and births rather than gunfights and graves. Now these fools had forced his hand. Tom strapped on his gun belt with movements made automatic by decades of practice. The leather had molded itself to his body long ago, and despite the years, it still felt like coming home. He checked the loads in his revolver. Though he knew each chamber held a cartridge, Tom Wade never carried an unloaded weapon, not in his lawman days, not now. The Winchester went into the saddle scabbard of his horse, a sturdy quarter horse named Judge who had served him faithfully through his final years as a ranger. Judge was 20 years old now, gray around the muzzle, but still sound and steady under fire. Some partnerships transcended age, and Tom trusted this horse with his life. As he saddled Judge in the pre-dawn darkness, Tom allowed himself to think about what came next. The Crimson Creek Gang had made their choice when they decided to prey on his neighbors and steal his cattle. They had sealed their fate when they mistook his desire for peace as evidence of weakness. Tom had tried retirement, had given it an honest effort for 2 full years. He had buried his guns, tended his cattle, and spoken to no one about the man he used to be. But some things you cannot walk away from, and justice was one of them. When evil men threatened good people, a man had only one choice if he wanted to sleep at night. The eastern sky showed the first hint of dawn as Tom Wade rode out from his barn, following the clear trail left by his stolen cattle. He rode straight-backed in the saddle, every inch the seasoned lawman despite his civilian clothes. The years fell away with each mile, and by the time the sun cleared the horizon, the man following that trail was no longer Tom Wade the retired rancher. He was Tom Wade the Texas Ranger, and the Crimson Creek Gang had just made the last mistake of their miserable lives. The morning sun had climbed halfway to its zenith when Tom Wade heard the thunder of approaching hoofs. He sat on his front porch in the old rocking chair Martha had loved, methodically cleaning his Winchester rifle with movements that spoke of decades of habit. To any observer, he appeared to be nothing more than an elderly rancher maintaining his equipment, but his pale blue eyes tracked every detail of the 6 riders approaching his homestead. Big Jake Morrison led the group, his massive frame casting a shadow even in the bright Montana sunshine. The gang leader wore his confidence like armor, secure in the knowledge that he commanded 5 of the most dangerous men in 3 territories. Behind him rode Snake-Eye Briggs, a lean man with a scar running from his left temple to his jawline, the result of a knife fight in Deadwood 5 years prior. The others spread out in a loose semicircle as they approached, a practiced formation designed to intimidate and control. Tom continued his methodical cleaning, running the oiled cloth along the rifle barrel with steady strokes. His weathered hands showed no tremor, though he had been careful to display such weakness whenever any of these men had seen him in town. The performance had served its purpose well. From inside the house came the soft sounds of his housekeeper, Martha Sullivan, preparing the midday meal. The 64-year-old widow had worked for Tom since his wife passed, keeping the house from falling into the despair that claimed so many widowers. She was a kind woman with gentle eyes and a fierce protective instinct when it came to those she cared about. Tom had grown fond of her companionship, though he maintained the careful distance of a man who had already buried one woman he loved. Big Jake dismounted with theatrical flourish, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with deliberate force. He stood 6'4" and carried himself like a man accustomed to having others step aside. His black beard was streaked with gray, and his dark eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had never met a victim he could not break. "Well now, old-timer," Big Jake said, his voice carrying the false friendliness that preceded violence. "Mighty fine morning for sitting on the porch. I imagine a man your age needs plenty of rest after all the excitement last night." Tom looked up from his rifle, his expression mild and curious. "I am sorry, but I do not believe we have been properly introduced. The name is Tom Wade, and this is my ranch. Might I ask what brings you gentlemen to my property?" The gang members exchanged glances, amused by what they perceived as genuine confusion. Snake-Eye Briggs spat into the dust, his scarred face twisted in contempt. "He really does not know, boss. Old fool slept right through us taking his cattle." Big Jake stepped closer to the porch, close enough that Tom could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the dried blood under his fingernails. "Now that is where you are wrong, Mr. Wade. You see, we did not take anything. We just moved some cattle that were wandering loose on public land. Terrible dangerous for livestock to be unattended like that. All sorts of accidents can happen to unprotected animals." Tom set down his cleaning cloth and looked directly into Big Jake's eyes. His voice remained calm and measured, but something had changed in his posture, a subtle straightening that suggested coiled strength beneath the appearance of frailty. "I see. And I suppose you boys just happened to be in the neighborhood when you discovered this wandering livestock." Snake-Eye laughed, a harsh sound like grinding metal. "Your cattle are long gone, old man. Sold them to a buyer down in Wyoming territory yesterday evening. Got a fair price, too, considering they were just strays we found." The front door of the house opened, and Martha Sullivan stepped onto the porch carrying a tray with a pitcher of water and a glass. She had been listening from inside, and her face showed the pale determination of a woman who had faced hard times before. She set the tray on the small table beside Tom's chair, her movements careful and deliberate. "I thought you might be getting thirsty, Mr. Wade," she said softly. "The morning is getting warm, and you have been working since before dawn." Big Jake's attention shifted to Martha, and his expression changed to something hungrier and more dangerous. "Well now, what do we have here?" "Afternoon, ma'am. I do not believe we have been introduced either. Jake Morrison is the name, and these are my associates." Martha kept her eyes lowered, recognizing the threat in the man's voice. She started to retreat toward the house, but Snake-Eye moved faster than his lean frame suggested possible. He caught her wrist in a grip that made her gasp, his fingers digging into the tender flesh with deliberate cruelty. "Now hold on there, sweetheart," Snake-Eye said, his voice thick with implied menace. "No need to be unfriendly. We are just having a neighborly conversation with your boss here. Maybe you could bring us some of that water too. A man works up a thirst doing honest work like moving stray cattle." Tom's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, quiet but carrying absolute authority. "The lady asked you to leave, son. I suggest you honor her request." The words hung in the silence that followed, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft whistle of wind through the cottonwood trees that shaded the house. Snake-Eye tightened his grip on Martha's wrist, his scarred face twisting into a cruel grin as he felt her try to pull away. "Did the old man just give me an order?" Snake-Eye asked Big Jake without taking his eyes off Tom. "I think my hearing might be going bad in my advanced age of 28 years. Big Jake laughed, but the sound held no warmth. He stepped onto the porch uninvited, his boot heels echoing on the weathered boards. "I think that is exactly what happened, Snake-Eye. The ancient here thinks he can tell us what to do. Tell me, Mr. Wade, what exactly are you planning to do if we decide not to listen to your suggestions?" Tom stood slowly, the Winchester rifle cradled in the crook of his left arm. His movements were unhurried, almost casual, but there was something about the way he held himself that made Dirty Pete Kowalski shift nervously in his saddle and reach for his gun butt. The other gang members spread out slightly, their instincts warning them that something was not quite right about the situation. "I am asking politely," Tom said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Release the lady and ride away. This does not have to go any further than words." Snake Eye jerked Martha closer to him, his free hand moving to the knife on his belt. The blade came free with a soft whisper of steel on leather, and he held it where she could see the sun reflecting off its sharp edge. "Maybe I will keep the lady for company while we discuss this business arrangement with you, old man. She looks like she could use some excitement in her life." That was the moment when Big Jake saw something change in Tom Wade's eyes. The pale blue depths went flat and cold, like winter ice over a deep lake. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, and it triggered warning bells in the gang leader's mind that he chose to ignore. "You boys have quite the reputation in this valley," Tom said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "I hear you have been making life difficult for a lot of good people. The McKinneys, for instance. Word is their place burned down last month after they refused to pay your protection money." Big Jake's chest swelled with pride at the mention of his handiwork. "That is right, old-timer. Terrible accident, that fire. Could happen to anyone who is not careful about their property. Houses made of dry timber, they just go up like kindling when the conditions are right." Tom nodded slowly, as if considering this information carefully. "And the Hendersons. I heard their oldest boy took a beating when they could not pay what you demanded. Broke his arm in 2 places, if I recall correctly." Snake Eye grinned, his grip on Martha's wrist tightening until tears appeared in her eyes. "The boy learned some manners that day. Sometimes education comes hard, but it sticks better when there is pain involved." The other gang members chuckled at this, enjoying the memory of violence inflicted on the helpless. Dirty Pete leaned forward in his saddle, his yellow teeth visible through his unkempt beard. "You forgot about the widow Johnson, Snake Eye. Remember how she screamed when we took her milk cows? Thought she was going to faint dead away." Big Jake walked to the edge of the porch and spat into Martha's flower garden, deliberately destroying the neat rows of marigolds she tended every morning. "This valley needs organizing, Mr. Wade. Too many people thinking they can just do whatever they want without paying for protection. Me and my boys, we provide a valuable service. We make sure accidents do not happen to folks who show proper respect." Tom's voice remained conversational, but the temperature around him seemed to drop several degrees. "And what kind of respect would that be, Mr. Morrison?" "The kind that comes with regular payments," Snake Eye answered, pressing the knife closer to Martha's throat. "Monthly contributions to our mutual benefit society. Very reasonable rates, considering the alternative." Tom looked directly at Big Jake, and something passed between the two men that made the gang leader take an involuntary step backward. "You mention accidents, Mr. Morrison. In my experience, accidents tend to happen to people who make poor choices. People who mistake kindness for weakness, for instance. People who threaten innocent folks when they should be minding their own business." Big Jake felt his confidence waver for the first time in months, but his pride would not allow him to back down in front of his men. "Are you threatening me, old man? Do you have any idea who you are talking to? I am Big Jake Morrison. I have killed 7 men in fair fights, and I run this valley. One word from me, and your house burns tonight just like the McKinney place." Tom stepped down from the porch, moving with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his apparent age. His pale eyes never left Big Jake's face, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "No, Mr. Morrison, I am not threatening you. I am making you a promise. You will release the lady, you will leave my property, and you will never come back. If you choose to ignore this advice, the consequences will be entirely your responsibility." Snake Eye laughed harshly and pressed his knife harder against Martha's throat, drawing a thin line of blood. "The old goat thinks he is some kind of gunfighter, boss. Maybe we should show him what happens to folks who do not show proper respect." Big Jake drew his Colt .44, a nickel-plate weapon that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The other gang members followed suit, filling their hands with iron as they prepared to end this farce once and for all. 6 guns against 1 old man seemed like excellent odds, especially considering their target appeared to be unarmed except for the rifle he held loosely in his left arm. "Last chance, Grandpa," Big Jake said, his voice thick with menace. "Get on your knees and beg for mercy, or we will put you down like a sick horse and burn your house with the woman inside." Tom Wade looked at each gang member in turn, his gaze cataloging weapons, positions, and skill levels with the professional assessment of a man who had faced such odds many times before. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You boys made your choice," he said simply. "Now I will make mine." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Big Jake felt something cold crawl up his spine, a primal warning that he had seriously misjudged his opponent. But pride and reputation demanded that he see this through, and he tightened his grip on his gun as he prepared to end Tom Wade's interference permanently. After an endless moment of tension, Tom stepped backward toward his house, his movements slow and deliberate. Snake Eye released Martha with a shove that sent her stumbling toward the front door, and the gang members holstered their weapons with the satisfied air of men who had won an easy victory. "Smart choice, old man," Big Jake called as he swung back into his saddle. "We will be back next week for your first payment. Have $50 ready, or start digging a grave for your lady friend." The gang rode away in a cloud of dust and harsh laughter, leaving Tom standing alone on his porch. He watched them disappear over the ridge before helping Martha to her feet, his weathered hands gentle as he examined the shallow cut on her throat. "I am so sorry, Mr. Wade," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I should not have come outside. I just thought." "You did nothing wrong, Martha," Tom said softly. "This is not your fault, and it is not something you need to worry about anymore." After Martha went inside to tend her wound, Tom walked behind his house to the small cemetery where his wife rested beneath a simple granite headstone. He knelt beside the grave, his weathered hands tracing the carved letters that spelled out Martha Wade, beloved wife, 18311-891. "Well, darling," he said quietly, his voice heavy with sorrow and resignation. "I tried to keep my promise about the peaceful life. I truly did. But some things a man cannot walk away from, not when innocent people are in danger." The wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, and Tom imagined he could hear his wife's voice in the rustling leaves, giving him the absolution he needed to do what came next. He rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and walked back toward the house where his guns waited in patient silence. The Crimson Creek gang had made their choice when they decided to prey on the helpless. Now Tom Wade would make his, and the devil himself would not be able to save them from the consequences. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Crimson Creek's main street as Tom Wade rode into town on Judge, his weathered quarter horse moving with the steady gait of an animal that had covered countless miles in the service of justice. Tom sat straight in the saddle, every inch the seasoned horseman despite his civilian clothes and the deliberate stoop he had cultivated during his 2 years of retirement. Today, however, something had changed in his bearing, a subtle shift that spoke of decisions made and lines crossed. The town of Crimson Creek had grown from a mining camp into a modest settlement of perhaps 300 souls, its single main street lined with the usual collection of businesses that served the surrounding ranches and farms. The general store occupied the largest building, its false front painted white with blue trim that had faded under the relentless Montana sun. Beside it stood Murphy's Saloon, a sturdy log structure that served as the unofficial town meeting hall and center of local gossip. The sheriff's office sat across the street, a small but solid building that projected more authority than its size would suggest. Tom dismounted in front of the general store and tied Judge to the hitching post with practiced efficiency. His Colt Peacemaker rode easy on his right hip, the worn walnut grips polished smooth by decades of handling. The gun belt itself was a work of art, hand-tooled leather that had molded itself to his frame over 40 years of service. To most observers, it appeared to be nothing more than an old man's affectation, a memento of younger days when he might have fancied himself a gunfighter. They could not have been more wrong. The bell above the store's door chimed softly as Tom entered, and old Henrik Mueller looked up from his ledger with the practiced smile of a merchant greeting a customer. Mueller was a German immigrant who had built his business through fair dealing and competitive prices, earning the respect of the community through honest work and genuine concern for his neighbors. His round face creased into genuine pleasure as he recognized his visitor. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wade," Mueller said in his careful English, still touched with the accent of his homeland. "It has been some time since we have seen you in town. I trust all is well at your ranch." Tom removed his hat, revealing silver hair that caught the light streaming through the store's windows. His pale blue eyes surveyed the interior with the automatic caution of a man who had survived by noticing details others missed. The store was well-stocked and organized, its shelves holding everything from bolts of cloth to farming implements. Near the back, a glass case displayed the shop's selection of ammunition and gun supplies. "Well enough, Henrik," Tom replied, his voice carrying its usual quiet authority. "I find myself in need of some supplies this afternoon. Ammunition primarily, and perhaps some rope if you have a good quality line in stock." Mueller nodded and moved toward the gun case, his keys jangling softly. "What caliber would you be needing, Mr. Wade? We have most common loads in stock, though the .45 Colt cartridges seem to be popular these days." "45 would be fine," Tom said, following the storekeeper to the back of the store. "2 boxes should suffice for my needs. And I will need them to be reliable loads, not the cheap ammunition that misfires when you need it most." As Mueller unlocked the case and retrieved the requested cartridges, the store's door chimed again. Tom glanced over his shoulder and saw a young man in a deputy sheriff's badge entering, his hand instinctively checking the position of his own weapon in the nervous habit of a lawman operating in dangerous territory. Deputy Billy Martinez was perhaps 25 years old, lean and quick with intelligent brown eyes that missed very little. He had been wearing the badge for only 6 months, but already showed the wariness of a man who had learned that predators walked among the peaceful citizens he was sworn to protect. Billy's gaze swept the store's interior and locked onto Tom's distinctive silhouette. Something about the older man's bearing triggered a memory, a half-remembered description from the stories that circulated among lawmen throughout the territories. The deputy's eyes dropped to Tom's gun belt, taking in the worn leather and the way the holster had been shaped by years of use. More specifically, he noticed how the Colt rode low on Tom's hip, positioned for speed rather than comfort. The deputy moved closer, his attention focused on the weapon's distinctive features. The Peacemaker's grips showed the kind of wear that came from daily handling, and the metal had been polished to a dull shine that would not reflect sunlight at the wrong moment. Most telling of all were the small modifications that marked it as a working gun rather than a showpiece. The trigger guard had been slightly enlarged, the hammer spur had been filed to prevent snagging, and the front sight had been replaced with a blade that would not catch the eye during a quick draw. Billy Martinez had heard descriptions of that particular weapon in the stories told around campfires and in frontier saloons. More importantly, he had heard descriptions of the man who carried it. "Sweet Jesus," Billy whispered, his voice barely audible in the store's quiet atmosphere. "That is Tom Wade. The Tom Wade." Henrik Mueller looked up from the ammunition boxes, his expression shifting to one of confusion and growing alarm. "I am sorry, Deputy Martinez, but I am not certain what you mean. This is Mr. Wade from the Bar W Ranch, one of our most respected customers." Billy stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Tom's profile. He studied the weathered features, the silver beard, and most tellingly, the pale blue eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated weight of 4 decades on the frontier. The deputy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as recognition crystallized into certainty. "Sir," Billy said with the careful respect of a young lawman addressing a living legend, "would you by any chance be Tom Wade, formerly of the Texas Rangers? The Tom Wade who served under Captain John Hughes during the fence-cutting wars?" Tom turned slowly to face the deputy, his expression carefully neutral. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The stooped posture of an aging rancher gave way to the straight-backed bearing of a man who had commanded respect through competence and courage. His pale eyes held Billy's gaze with the steady intensity of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and making life-or-death decisions in the space of a heartbeat. "I wore a ranger badge for 40 years, Tom said simply. "Retired 2 years ago after my wife passed. I came to Montana seeking peace and a chance to build something gentle with the time I have left." Henrik Mueller's face went pale as the implications of this revelation sank in. He had read newspaper accounts of the legendary Texas Ranger whose exploits had become the stuff of frontier mythology. Stories of gunfights won against impossible odds, of outlaws brought to justice when other lawmen had failed, of a man whose reputation alone had ended conflicts before they could begin. The mild-mannered customer who bought supplies in his store was one of the most famous lawmen in the American West. Deputy Martinez swallowed hard and straightened to attention as if reporting to a superior officer. "Sir, I have heard the stories. They say you trained Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp in the finer points of gunfighting. They say you faced down the entire Dalton gang in Coffeyville and walked away without a scratch. They say you killed 31 men in the line of duty and never lost a night's sleep over any of them." Tom's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained watchful. "Stories tend to grow in the telling, son. I served my time and did my duty the best way I knew how. Some men died because they chose to resist arrest rather than face a judge and jury. I take no pride in that, but I harbor no regrets either. Every man I killed had a weapon in his hand and murder in his heart." Billy nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind those simple words. He had heard enough stories to know that Tom Wade's reputation was built on solid ground rather than frontier exaggeration. The man standing before him had faced some of the most dangerous criminals in the territories and emerged victorious through skill, courage, and an unshakable commitment to justice. Henrik Mueller finished wrapping the ammunition in brown paper, his movements automatic as his mind struggled to process this new information. He had served one of the most famous lawmen in American history countless times, treating him as nothing more than a retired rancher with a small spread outside town. The irony was not lost on him, and he found himself wondering what other secrets the quiet men of the frontier carried. As Tom paid for his purchases, the store's door chimed again. This time the newcomer was Dirty Pete Kowalski, a member of Big Jake Morrison's gang who had ridden into town to purchase tobacco and whiskey. Pete was a small, wiry man with yellowed teeth and the nervous energy of someone who lived by violence and cunning rather than honest work. His eyes swept the store's interior, cataloging potential threats and opportunities with the automatic caution of a career criminal. Pete's gaze locked onto Tom's distinctive profile, and recognition sparked in his predatory stare. He had seen the old rancher around town before, noting him as a potential victim for the gang's protection racket. But something about Tom's bearing today triggered alarm bells in the outlaw's mind. There was a subtle change in the way the older man carried himself, a shift from apparent vulnerability to quiet confidence that spoke of hidden strength. More disturbing still was the respectful attention being paid to Tom by Deputy Martinez. Pete had sized up the young lawman as competent but inexperienced, someone who could be intimidated or eliminated if necessary. Seeing Billy show such deference to the old rancher suggested complications that Big Jake needed to know about immediately. Pete backed toward the door, his hand instinctively checking the position of his gun. Something was wrong with this picture, and his criminal instincts screamed warnings that he was smart enough to heed. He slipped out of the store without making his purchases, his mind already focused on the urgent ride back to the gang's hideout in Box Canyon. Tom noticed Pete's hasty departure, but showed no outward reaction beyond a slight tightening around his eyes. He completed his business with Henrik Mueller, accepting the wrapped ammunition and coiled rope with polite thanks. His conversation with Deputy Martinez remained cordial but professional, the kind of exchange between current and former lawmen who understood the burdens of their shared calling. As Tom prepared to leave the store, Billy Martinez cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Wade, if you do not mind me asking, what brings you to town today? It is unusual to see you here during the week, and you seem to be purchasing supplies for serious work." Tom's pale eyes met the deputy's concerned gaze. "Let us just say that some situations require a man to remember old skills, son. The valley has been troubled lately, and sometimes retired does not mean finished." Billy nodded slowly, understanding the implications even if he did not grasp the specifics. He had heard about the Crimson Creek gang's activities and knew that the local law was inadequate to deal with such a well-organized criminal enterprise. If Tom Wade was preparing for action, it meant that someone had pushed the legendary lawman beyond his considerable patience. Tom left the store and walked across the street toward Murphy's saloon, his spurs making soft chiming sounds against the wooden sidewalk. The saloon was busy for a weekday afternoon, filled with ranch hands and townspeople seeking relief from the heat and the company of their neighbors. Conversations died as Tom entered, though he doubted most of the patrons understood why his presence commanded such attention. Behind the bar, Seamus Murphy looked up from the glass he was polishing and felt his blood turn to ice water. Like Deputy Martinez, Murphy had heard the stories and recognized the man whose reputation had traveled far beyond the borders of Texas. The bartender's hands began to shake slightly as he considered the implications of Tom Wade's presence in his establishment. Murphy began whispering urgently to his regular customers, spreading word of their famous visitor with the speed that only frontier gossip could achieve. Within minutes, every person in the saloon knew that they were in the presence of living legend, and the atmosphere grew thick with anticipation and nervous energy. Tom ordered a whiskey and stood at the bar, his back to the wall in the automatic positioning of a man who had survived by never allowing enemies to approach from behind. He sipped his drink slowly, his senses attuned to every conversation and movement in the crowded room. The whiskey was good, smooth enough to suggest that Murphy took pride in his establishment and cared about the quality of what he served. After finishing his drink, Tom walked to the small cemetery that occupied a hill overlooking the town. The graveyard was well maintained, with neat rows of headstones marking the final resting places of Crimson Creek's departed citizens. Tom moved among the graves with the measured pace of a man reading a story written in granite and loss. 7 headstones caught his attention, their granite surfaces still sharp-edged and unmarked by weather. These were recent graves, all bearing dates within the past 6 months. As Tom read the names and dates, his jaw tightened with each revelation. William McKinney, aged 42, died in a house fire. Sarah Henderson, aged 38, died from injuries sustained in a fall. Thomas Johnson, aged 55, died from complications following a beating. Each grave told the same story of lives cut short by violence, disguised as accidents or misfortune. These were Big Jake Morrison's victims, good people who had refused to submit to extortion and paid the ultimate price for their courage. Tom stood before each grave in turn, memorizing the names and committing their stories to the part of his heart that had never quite healed from 4 decades of seeing injustice triumph over innocence. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Tom made his way back to Judge and prepared for the ride home. His mind was clear now, his course of action decided by the evidence of evil that surrounded him. He had tried retirement, had given peace an honest chance for 2 full years. But some things a man could not walk away from, and justice was paramount among them. The dying words of his beloved wife echoed in his memory as he swung into the saddle. "No more killing unless innocents need protecting," she had whispered during their final conversation. Tom had promised her then that his guns would remain silent unless good people faced threats that no one else could handle. The fresh graves in Crimson Creek's cemetery released him from that promise. Martha would have understood that some evils could only be stopped by controlled violence applied with precision and absolute commitment. The Crimson Creek gang had chosen their path when they decided to prey on the helpless. Now Tom Wade would choose his, and neither heaven nor hell would deflect him from the course that honor demanded. The sun hung low over the Montana horizon, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed prophetic in their beauty. Tom Wade sat on his front porch in the same rocking chair where he had received the gang's ultimatum that morning, but everything else had changed. Gone was the performance of frailty and age that had served him so well during his retirement. In its place sat a man who radiated the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death countless times and emerged victorious through skill, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice. His Winchester rifle lay across his knees, freshly cleaned and loaded with hand-selected cartridges that he had crafted himself during the long winter evenings. Each round represented decades of experience in the precise application of controlled violence, and Tom took grim satisfaction in knowing that every shot would find its intended target. His Colt Peacemaker rode easy on his right hip, the worn walnut grips positioned exactly where his hand expected to find them after 40 years of practice in combat. Behind him, the house stood silent and secure. Martha Sullivan had departed for town hours earlier, escorted by a trusted neighbor who understood that the evening would bring violence to the Bar W Ranch. Tom had been careful to ensure that no innocent blood would be spilled in the confrontation that was coming. though he harbored no such concerns about the men who had chosen to make themselves his enemies. The sound of approaching horses reached him long before the riders came into view, and Tom's pale blue eyes tracked their progress across the valley with the professional assessment of a man who had survived by understanding his opponents better than they understood themselves. 6 riders, moving in a loose formation designed more for intimidation than tactical effectiveness. They rode with the careless confidence of men who had never faced serious opposition, and their approach betrayed fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of violence and the men who wielded it with deadly precision. Big Jake Morrison led the group, his massive frame imposing even at a distance. The gang leader had spent the afternoon drinking and working himself into the kind of rage that made stupid men dangerous and dangerous men dead. Behind him rode Snake-Eye Briggs, his scarred face twisted into anticipation of the violence he believed would restore their authority over the valley. Dirty Pete Kowalski fidgeted in his saddle, nervous energy radiating from his wiry frame as he recalled the scene at the general store and the respectful attention paid to the old rancher by Deputy Martinez. The other 3 gang members spread out as they approached the house, their hands resting on their gun butts in the casual display of armed authority that had intimidated so many innocent people. They carried themselves like men who expected easy victory, and their positioning revealed fundamental tactical errors that would prove costly in the minutes to come. Tom continued his methodical cleaning of the Winchester, running the oiled cloth along the barrel with movements that spoke of decades of habit and careful maintenance. His breathing remained steady and controlled, the result of training that had begun in his teenage years and been refined through 4 decades of life-or-death encounters. To any observer, he appeared to be nothing more than an elderly rancher tending his weapons, but beneath the surface calm lay the coiled readiness of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Big Jake dismounted 20 yards from the porch, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with deliberate force. His hand rested on the butt of his nickel-plate Colt, and his dark eyes burned with the kind of fury that came from having his authority questioned by someone he considered beneath his notice. The gang leader had built his reputation through intimidation and overwhelming force, crushing opposition before it could organize or find the courage to resist. He had never faced a man like Tom Wade, though he would understand his mistakes soon enough. "Well now, old man," Big Jake called, his voice thick with whiskey and barely controlled rage. "I see you have been busy this afternoon. Word around town is that you have been telling stories about who you used to be. Trying to make yourself sound important, are you?" Tom looked up from his rifle, his pale eyes meeting Big Jake's furious stare with the calm assessment of a professional evaluating an opponent. His voice carried its usual quiet authority, but underneath lay something harder and more dangerous than anything the gang had encountered in their months of terrorizing the valley. "I have told no stories, Mr. Morrison. I have simply been preparing for our next conversation. I believe I mentioned this morning that you boys had made your choice. Now you will discover the consequences of that decision." Snake-Eye Briggs spat into the dust and moved his hand closer to his gun, the nervous energy of violence building in his scarred frame. "You think we are impressed by your little shopping trip to town, old man. You think buying ammunition makes you dangerous. I have killed 12 men with this knife alone, and I am looking forward to making it 13. The other gang members spread out in what they believed was a tactical formation, but Tom recognized their positioning as the amateur work of men who had succeeded through numbers and intimidation rather than skill and training. They left themselves exposed to crossfire, blocked each other's lines of retreat, and failed to secure the high ground that would have given them significant advantage in the coming fight. Tom set down his cleaning cloth and stood slowly, the Winchester cradled in the crook of his left arm. His movements were unhurried and deliberate, the result of training that had taught him to conserve energy and maintain perfect control even in the moments before violence erupted. His right hand hung loose at his side, positioned exactly where it needed to be to reach his Colt in one smooth, practiced motion. "Gentlemen," Tom said, his voice carrying across the yard with the weight of absolute authority, "this is your final opportunity to mount your horses and ride away from this place. What happens next will be entirely your responsibility, and I want that clearly understood before we proceed." Big Jake laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor or warmth. He drew his nickel-plate revolver with a flourish that was designed more for intimidation than speed, holding the weapon where Tom could see its polished surface gleaming in the dying sunlight. The other gang members followed suit, filling their hands with iron as they prepared to end this farce once and for all. "You think you scare us with your big talk and your fancy cleaning routine," Big Jake sneered. "I have news for you, Grandpa. We are the Crimson Creek Gang, and we take what we want from whoever we want. Right now, I want you dead and your house burned, and I want your woman to watch it happen before we take our payment out of her hide." That was the moment when Tom Wade's eyes went completely cold, all pretense of civilization disappearing like smoke in a winter wind. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, and it triggered warning bells in Dirty Pete's criminal instincts that made him shift nervously in his saddle. The old rancher was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous and infinitely more competent than anything the gang had ever encountered. "I gave you a chance to walk away," Tom said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "What happens now is on your heads alone." Snake Eye drew first, his knife flashing as he lunged toward the porch with the fluid motion of a man who had killed many times before. His scarred face was twisted into a snarl of anticipated triumph, and his eyes burned with the predatory joy of a hunter closing in on helpless prey. He had covered perhaps 3 steps when Tom's rifle spoke with the authority of precision and 4 decades of experience. The Winchester's roar echoed across the valley like thunder, and Snake Eye's charge ended abruptly as the heavy bullet took him through the right shoulder. The impact spun him around and sent him crashing into the dust, his knife flying from nerveless fingers as he screamed in pain and shock. The shot had been placed with surgical precision, designed to disable rather than kill, though the message it sent was unmistakable. Tom worked the Winchester's lever with practiced efficiency, the spent brass casing arcing through the air as a fresh round chambered with a metallic click that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. His movements were economical and professional, wasting no motion as he brought the rifle to bear on his next target. Big Jake fired his nickel-plate Colt in a fury of rage and disbelief, but his shots went wide as Tom dropped behind the porch railing with fluid grace. The gang leader's marksmanship suffered from anger and whiskey, and his bullets splintered wood instead of finding flesh. His face had gone pale beneath his beard as he began to understand that he had seriously misjudged his opponent. The other gang members opened fire in a ragged volley that spoke of panic rather than tactical thinking. Their shots chewed splinters from the porch and shattered the front window of Tom's house, but failed to find their intended target. Tom had anticipated their reaction and positioned himself where their lack of coordination would work against them, using the sturdy log construction of his home as cover while he planned his next moves. From behind the porch railing, Tom's voice carried the weight of professional assessment and grim certainty. 6 guns against 1, boys. Poor odds for you, considering the quality of your marksmanship and your complete lack of tactical awareness. You might want to surrender now while you still have the option. Big Jake screamed orders at his remaining men, his authority cracking under the pressure of facing an opponent who refused to be intimidated. The gang members tried to advance on the house, but their approach was hampered by their own crossfire and the absolute accuracy of Tom's return shots. The Winchester spoke again, and Dirty Pete's horse went down with a bullet through the head, pinning the outlaw beneath its weight and effectively removing him from the fight. The sound of approaching hooves announced the arrival of Deputy Billy Martinez, who had ridden hard from town after receiving word of the impending confrontation. The young lawman took in the scene with professional assessment, noting the tactical situation and the obvious skill disparity between the combatants. He dismounted behind cover and called out his identification, though his sympathies were clearly aligned with Tom rather than the gang that had terrorized his jurisdiction for months. "Tom Wade," Billy shouted over the gunfire. "This is Deputy Martinez. I have a telegram here from Austin with information about your service record. Says here you killed 31 men in the line of duty during 40 years as a Texas Ranger. Says you trained some of the most famous lawmen in the territories, including Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp. Says they called your technique the Wade Draw, and that no man ever bested you in a fair fight." The words hit the surviving gang members like physical blows, and their firing slackened as the implications sank in. They had not cornered an elderly rancher. They had walked into a trap set by one of the most legendary gunfighters in the history of the American West. Big Jake's face went from pale to gray as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Tom rose from behind the railing with fluid grace, his rifle tracking toward Big Jake with the mechanical precision of a man who had performed similar actions hundreds of times before. His voice carried across the yard with the weight of absolute certainty and professional competence. 40 years wearing a badge, he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. 31 men who chose to fight rather than surrender. Each one armed and dangerous. Each one given the same chance I offered you boys. Not a single one faster or smarter than necessary. Would any of you like to test your skills against that record? The surviving gang members looked at each other with growing panic, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. They had built their reputations by preying on farmers and shopkeepers, not by facing trained killers with decades of experience. The tactical situation had shifted completely, and they found themselves trapped in the open against an opponent who held every advantage except numbers. Dirty Pete struggled to free himself from beneath his dead horse, his face twisted with pain and terror as he realized his predicament. The other two gang members, brothers named Joe and Frank Carson, began backing toward their horses with the desperate urgency of men who understood that staying meant dying. Tom's pale eyes tracked each movement with the professional assessment of a predator cataloging his prey. He had fought outnumbered before, had faced worse odds in situations where retreat was impossible and victory demanded the perfect application of violence and tactical thinking. This confrontation was already won, though the gang members did not yet understand their situation clearly enough to surrender. The Winchester roared again, and Joe Carson spun around with a bullet through his gun arm. The heavy slug shattered bone and sent his revolver flying into the dust, effectively removing him from the fight without ending his life. Tom's precision was surgical, each shot placed exactly where it would accomplish his tactical goals while minimizing unnecessary killing. Frank Carson tried to mount his horse and flee, but Tom's next shot dropped the animal before the outlaw could swing into the saddle. The man fell hard, his leg trapped beneath the dying horse as he screamed for mercy that Tom was not inclined to grant. The systematic elimination of their escape routes was having its intended effect, and panic began to replace coordination among the surviving gang members. Big Jake fired his remaining rounds in a desperate fusillade that accomplished nothing except emptying his weapon and revealing his position. Tom rose from cover and walked down the porch steps with measured calm, his Winchester held ready as he approached the gang leader who had terrorized the valley for months. His pale eyes were cold as winter ice, and his voice carried the weight of professional judgment. "Reload if you can, Morrison," Tom said quietly. "I want this to be fair when I kill you." 40 years of wearing a badge taught me that every man deserves the chance to face his fate with a weapon in his hand, even scum like you who prey on innocent people. Big Jake's hands shook as he fumbled for cartridges, his earlier confidence completely shattered by the demonstration of skill and tactical superiority he had witnessed. The nickel-plate Colt felt foreign in his trembling fingers as he tried to reload under the steady gaze of a man who radiated deadly competence. Deputy Martinez moved closer, his own weapon drawn, but pointed safely toward the ground. He had never seen such a display of controlled violence, and his respect for Tom Wade increased with each perfectly placed shot. The young lawman was witnessing history in the making, a final demonstration of skills that had made Tom Wade a legend throughout the territories. Tom stood 20 feet from Big Jake, the Winchester held casually in his left hand, while his right remained free and ready. His positioning was perfect, offering his opponent a clear shot while maintaining every advantage that experience and superior skill could provide. This was the moment when the gang leader would learn the difference between reputation and reality, between intimidating farmers and facing a man who had built his legend through 4 decades of surviving encounters exactly like this one. The sound of Big Jake's Colt clicking into battery was unnaturally loud in the evening silence. Tom's pale eyes never wavered from his opponent's face, reading the telltale signs of fear and desperation that marked a man who had finally encountered an enemy he could not defeat. When the gang leader raised his weapon for the final time, Tom Wade was ready with the patience and precision that had kept him alive through 40 years of similar moments. What happened next would be decided in the space of a heartbeat, measured in the time it took a man's hand to move from rest to action. But the outcome was already determined by the fundamental differences between a professional lawman and a criminal who had succeeded through cruelty rather than competence. Big Jake Morrison was about to learn why Tom Wade's name was spoken with reverence and fear throughout 3 territories, and why no man had ever bested him in a fair fight. The evening air hung thick with gun smoke and the copper scent of blood as Tom Wade stood 20 feet from Big Jake Morrison, his pale blue eyes locked on the gang leader's face with the unwavering focus of a predator who had cornered his prey. The nickel-plate Colt in Jake's trembling hands gleamed in the dying sunlight, but the weapon might as well have been made of lead for all the confidence it provided its bearer. The gang leader's face had gone gray with the realization that he faced a man whose reputation had been built on the graves of better gunfighters than himself. Big Jake's breathing came in short, ragged gasps as he struggled to steady his aim. The casual confidence that had carried him through months of terrorizing innocent people had evaporated like morning mist, replaced by the cold understanding that he stood before a living legend who had survived 4 decades of similar confrontations. His nickel-plate revolver felt foreign in his grip, the familiar weight now seeming inadequate against an opponent whose very presence radiated deadly competence. "You know who I am now," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You know what I have done, and you know how this ends. But I'm going to give you the same chance I gave every other man who chose to dance this dance with me. When you are ready, make your move." Deputy Billy Martinez watched from his position behind cover, his young face tense with the knowledge that he was witnessing history in the making. The stories of Tom Wade's legendary speed and accuracy had seemed like frontier mythology until this moment. But the systematic dismantling of the Crimson Creek Gang had proven that reality exceeded even the most elaborate tales. Billy's hand rested on his own weapon, though he understood that his intervention would be neither necessary nor welcome in what was about to unfold. The surviving gang members lay scattered across the yard in various states of injury and defeat. Snake Eye Briggs clutched his shattered shoulder and moaned softly in the dust, his scarred face twisted with pain and the bitter knowledge that his reputation meant nothing against true skill. Dirty Pete Kowalski remained trapped beneath his dead horse, his earlier bravado replaced by the whimpering terror of a man who had finally encountered someone more dangerous than himself. The Carson brothers huddled against their fallen mounts, their weapons lost, and their fighting spirit broken by the demonstration of precision violence they had witnessed. Time seemed suspended in the space between heartbeats as Big Jake tried to summon the courage to face his fate. His reputation had been built on intimidation and overwhelming numbers, but now he stood alone against a man whose every movement spoke of deadly competence earned through 4 decades of surviving encounters that had killed lesser men. The gang leader's hand trembled as he raised his weapon, and Tom could read the desperation in his enemy's eyes like words written in blood. "Draw, you son of a bitch," Big Jake screamed, his voice cracking with fear and rage. "Draw and let us finish this." Tom's right hand moved with the fluid grace of water flowing downhill, 40 years of practice and muscle memory combining in a motion too fast for the human eye to follow completely. The Colt Peacemaker appeared in his grip as if materialized by magic, the worn walnut grips fitting his hand like they had been carved specifically for his fingers. The weapon aligned itself with Big Jake's center mass through instinct and training that had been refined to perfection through countless hours of practice and the harsh education of real combat. Big Jake's shot came first by a fraction of a second, his desperation causing him to fire before his aim was true. The bullet whistled past Tom's left ear, close enough that he could feel the wind of its passage, but accuracy under pressure was a skill that came only with experience and natural talent. The gang leader possessed neither in sufficient quantity to matter against an opponent who had faced superior marksmen and emerged victorious through preparation and an unshakable commitment to excellence. Tom's return shot spoke with the authority of professional competence and 4 decades of survival. The heavy .45 caliber bullet took Big Jake through the center of his chest with surgical precision, the impact lifting the gang leader off his feet and sending him crashing backward into the dust. The nickel-plate Colt flew from his nerveless fingers, its polished surface catching the last rays of sunlight as it arced through the air and landed with a metallic clatter near the porch steps. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft moaning of the wounded and the distant sound of wind through the cottonwood trees. Tom stood motionless for a long moment, his weapon still trained on Big Jake's fallen form, while his pale eyes scanned the yard for any remaining threats. The other gang members showed no inclination to continue the fight, their spirits broken by the systematic demonstration of skills that had made their leader's death seem inevitable rather than surprising. Big Jake Morrison lay on his back in the Montana dust, his dark eyes staring sightlessly at the darkening sky as blood pooled beneath his massive frame. His final expression held a mixture of surprise and belated understanding, as if he had finally grasped the magnitude of his mistake in the last moments of his life. The man who had terrorized an entire valley through violence and intimidation had died as he had lived, through the application of force, though this time he had been on the receiving end of superior skill and righteous purpose. Tom lowered his weapon and walked slowly toward the fallen gang leader, his movements careful and controlled as he approached the man whose crimes had forced him out of retirement. He knelt beside Big Jake's body with the respectful solemnity of a professional acknowledging a defeated opponent, though his pale eyes showed no satisfaction in the violence that had been necessary to protect innocent people. Deputy Martinez emerged from cover and approached the scene with his weapon drawn, though the threat had clearly been neutralized. The young lawman's face showed a mixture of awe and professional respect as he surveyed the aftermath of what would undoubtedly become one of the most famous gunfights in territorial history. Billy had witnessed the end of the Crimson Creek Gang's reign of terror, and he understood that the valley would sleep safer because of what Tom Wade had done this evening. As Billy began securing the surviving gang members, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of several townspeople who had heard the gunfire and ridden out to investigate. Among them was old Henrik Mueller from the general store, his round face pale with concern and curiosity about what had transpired at the Bar W Ranch. Behind him rode Doc Henderson, the local physician whose services would be needed to treat the wounded and examine the dead. Tom stood slowly and holstered his Colt with the automatic movements of a man who had performed such actions countless times before. His face showed no triumph or satisfaction, only the grim acceptance of a job completed with professional competence. The weight of ending another human life sat heavily on his shoulders, even when that life had belonged to a man whose continued existence threatened innocent people. Doc Henderson dismounted and began tending to the wounded gang members with the professional detachment of a physician who had seen too much frontier violence. Snake-Eye Briggs would live, though his gun arm would never function properly again. Dirty Pete Kowalski had suffered only minor injuries from his trapped position, though his spirit seemed permanently broken by the demonstration of superior force he had witnessed. The Carson brothers would recover from their wounds, though their days as members of a criminal organization had clearly ended. Henrik Mueller approached Tom with the respectful caution of a civilian addressing a living legend. "Mr. Wade," he said quietly, his accent thick with emotion, "the entire valley owes you a debt that can never be repaid. These men have terrorized our families for months, and the law seemed powerless to stop them." Tom's pale eyes met the storekeeper's grateful gaze with the steady regard of a man who had done his duty without expectation of reward or recognition. "No debt is owed, Henrik. This is what happens when evil men mistake kindness for weakness and push decent folks beyond their limits. The valley will be safer now, and that is payment enough for any man." Deputy Martinez finished securing the prisoners and approached Tom with official business that needed to be addressed. "Mr. Wade, I will need your statement about what happened here, though I doubt anyone will question the justification for your actions. These men were wanted for robbery, extortion, and murder in 3 territories. You have done the law a considerable service by ending their criminal enterprise." As the evening progressed and the immediate aftermath was managed, Billy Martinez shared intelligence he had gathered about the gang's operations. Based on information extracted from the surviving members, the stolen cattle from multiple ranches had been hidden in Box Canyon, about 15 miles north of the Bar W Ranch. The canyon was a natural fortress with narrow access points, perfect for concealing rustled livestock until they could be moved to buyers in distant territories. Tom agreed to guide a recovery expedition the following morning, his local knowledge and tactical experience proving invaluable in planning the operation. The stolen cattle represented the life savings of 7 different ranching families, and their recovery would go far toward restoring the economic stability that the gang's predations had threatened. More importantly, it would provide concrete evidence of the criminal organization's scope and impact on the local community. As the townspeople prepared to return to Crimson Creek with their prisoners and wounded, Tom stood alone in his yard and surveyed the scene of violence that had been forced upon his peaceful retirement. The bodies of 2 dead horses and 1 dead gang leader served as stark reminders that his attempt to leave his violent past behind had failed completely. Some men could not escape their nature, and Tom Wade was apparently destined to serve justice until the day he joined his beloved Martha in whatever waited beyond this life. His weathered hands began to shake as the adrenaline that had sustained him through the confrontation finally faded from his system. This was the cost of violence that civilians never understood, the physical and emotional toll that came after the immediate danger had passed. Tom had killed 32 men now, and each death had left its mark on his soul, even when the alternative was allowing evil to triumph over innocence. Deputy Martinez approached with a final question that needed to be addressed before the official investigation could be concluded. Mr. Wade, the territorial governor has been looking for experienced lawmen to help establish order in the more remote regions. Would you consider accepting a commission as a federal marshal? Your reputation and demonstrated skills would be invaluable in dealing with criminal organizations like this one. Tom's pale eyes looked past the young deputy toward the small cemetery where his wife rested beneath the Montana soil. He had made her a promise about leaving violence behind, but recent events had proven that sometimes a man's nature and the world's needs made such promises impossible to keep. The valley was safer now, but other valleys faced similar threats that only experienced lawmen could address effectively. I will consider it, son, Tom said quietly. But right now, I have cattle to recover and a valley to help heal from months of fear and violence. Sometimes the most important service a man can provide is simply being willing to stand up when others cannot or will not. Tonight, that was enough. Tomorrow, we will see what other duties honor demands. As the last of the townspeople departed for Crimson Creek with their prisoners and wounded, Tom Wade stood alone on his porch and watched the stars appear in the darkening Montana sky. The Crimson Creek gang was finished, their reign of terror ended by the application of professional violence against men who had mistaken brutality for strength. But Tom knew that others would eventually take their place, drawn by the same opportunities and weaknesses that had allowed this group to flourish. The difference would be that the valley now knew it was defended by a man whose reputation had been earned through 4 decades of serving justice in places where law existed only in the hearts of those brave enough to enforce it. Tom Wade had tried retirement, had given peace an honest effort for 2 full years. But some callings could not be abandoned, and protecting innocent people from predators was apparently his permanent destiny. He walked inside his empty house and poured himself a whiskey, toasting the memory of his beloved wife and the promise he had been forced to break. Martha would have understood that some evils could only be stopped through controlled violence, and she would have supported his decision to act when no one else could or would. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight, the valley could sleep peacefully for the first time in months. The legend of Tom Wade had been reborn in the dust and gunsmoke of his front yard, and every criminal organization in 3 territories would soon learn that Montana was protected by a man who had forgotten more about applied violence than most men would ever learn. The Crimson Creek gang had made their choice when they decided to prey on innocent people. Now they had paid the price for that choice with their lives, their freedom, and their reputations. Justice had been served with the precision and finality that only comes from the barrel of a gun held by a man who understands the true cost of both violence and mercy. 3 weeks after the gunfight that ended the Crimson Creek gang's reign of terror, the stolen cattle had been recovered from Box Canyon and returned to their rightful owners throughout the valley. Tom Wade had led the recovery expedition with the same methodical precision he had applied to dismantling the criminal organization, ensuring that every head of livestock was properly identified and restored to families who had suffered under months of extortion and theft. The canyon had yielded more than stolen cattle. Hidden among the rocks and crude shelters, Deputy Billy Martinez discovered detailed records of the gang's criminal activities, including lists of victims, amounts extorted, and plans for expanding their operations into neighboring territories. The evidence painted a picture of systematic terrorism that had been building toward complete control over the region's economic and social structure. Tom had refused all offers of reward money from the grateful ranching families, instead directing that any recovered funds be used to rebuild what the gang had destroyed. Barns were raised, fences repaired, and livestock replaced through the collective effort of a community that had rediscovered its strength through witnessing one man's willingness to stand against impossible odds. The Bar W Ranch had returned to its peaceful routine, though Martha Sullivan now carried a small derringer in her apron pocket, and the house showed the scars of bullet holes that Tom had chosen to leave unrepaired. They served as reminders that evil could emerge from any direction, and that constant vigilance was the price of maintaining the civilization that allowed good people to live in peace. Deputy Billy Martinez had become a frequent visitor to the ranch, his official duties providing convenient excuses for conversations that had evolved into informal training sessions. Tom found himself sharing 4 decades of accumulated wisdom about reading men's intentions, understanding tactical situations, and maintaining the mental discipline required for survival in violent encounters. The young lawman absorbed these lessons with the hunger of someone who understood their value through recent experience. "Billy," Tom said one afternoon as they practiced quick-draw techniques behind the barn, "the most important thing you can learn is that violence should always be the last resort. But when it becomes necessary, you must apply it with absolute commitment and precision. Hesitation in a gunfight is just another word for suicide." The deputy nodded gravely, his young face serious with the responsibility of carrying on traditions that stretched back to the earliest days of frontier law enforcement. He had witnessed the systematic dismantling of a criminal organization by one man armed with superior skills and unshakable determination, and he understood that such demonstrations of competence were becoming increasingly rare as the frontier gave way to more civilized forms of justice. 6 months had passed since that violent evening when the sounds of gunfire echoed across the valley, and Crimson Creek had transformed itself into a thriving community where families could raise their children without fear. New businesses had opened, encouraged by the stability that came from knowing that predators would face swift and certain justice. The town's population had grown as word spread that this particular valley was defended by forces that criminal organizations could not overcome or intimidate. Tom's reputation had spread far beyond Montana's borders, carried by travelers and lawmen who recognized the significance of what had transpired at the Bar W Ranch. Federal marshals consulted with him on matters involving organized crime, and territorial governors sought his advice on establishing effective law enforcement in remote regions. But Tom had declined all offers of official positions, preferring to remain available for situations that required his particular skills while maintaining the peaceful retirement he had promised his late wife. As I reflect on this tale of courage and justice, I find myself wondering how it resonates with each of you listening today. Have you ever faced a moment when standing up for what is right required more courage than you thought you possessed? Have you witnessed someone like Tom Wade, who found the strength to act when others could not or would not? These stories of frontier justice speak to something deep in the human spirit, that desire to see good triumph over evil through the actions of ordinary people who choose to be extraordinary when circumstances demand it. I would love to hear your thoughts about what this story means to you and how it connects to your own experiences with standing up for justice in your daily lives. 1 year after the confrontation, Deputy Billy Martinez had been elected sheriff of the county, his reputation enhanced by his association with Tom Wade and his demonstrated competence in handling the aftermath of the gang's destruction. His first official act had been to offer Tom a permanent position as chief deputy, an honor that the retired ranger had politely declined while promising to remain available for consultation on matters that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities. Billy's wedding to Sarah McKinney, daughter of one of the families whose ranch had been burned by the gang, had been attended by the entire valley community. Tom had served as best man for the ceremony, his presence lending dignity and significance to the celebration of new life emerging from the ashes of past violence. The young couple had named their first son Thomas Wade Martinez, ensuring that the legacy of courage and justice would continue into the next generation. 2 years later, Tom sat on his front porch in the same rocking chair where he had faced down 6 armed criminals with nothing but superior skill and unshakable determination. The bullet holes in his house had weathered to match the surrounding wood, and the small cemetery behind his home now held 3 graves instead of 2. Judge, his faithful quarter horse, had passed peacefully in his sleep the previous winter, earning a place of honor beside Tom's beloved wife Martha. The valley spread out before him in the golden light of a Montana afternoon, dotted with thriving ranches and filled with the sounds of children playing in safety their parents had never known during the gang's reign of terror. Cattle grazed peacefully in pastures protected by fences that no one dared to cut, and the smoke rising from distant chimneys spoke of families gathered around dinner tables where conversations flowed without fear of violence intruding on their domestic happiness. Sheriff Martinez rode up the familiar path with his 3-year-old son Thomas perched proudly in front of him on the saddle, the child's eyes bright with curiosity about the legendary man they had come to visit. Young Thomas had heard stories about his namesake, tales of courage and justice that had become part of the valley's oral tradition, passed down from parents to children as examples of how ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demanded heroic action. "Uncle Tom," the child called out with the familiarity of someone who had never known a world where evil men could terrorize innocent families without facing immediate and overwhelming retaliation. "Daddy says you taught him how to be brave when bad men come to hurt people." Tom lifted the boy from the saddle and settled him on his knee, his weathered hands gentle as they had been with his own children in what seemed like another lifetime. "Being brave does not mean you are not afraid, Thomas. It means you do what needs to be done even when you are afraid, especially when good people are counting on you to protect them." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Tom of another evening when violence had been necessary to preserve peace, he reflected on the choices that had brought him to this moment of contentment. His guns remained within easy reach, cleaned and maintained with the devotion of a craftsman who understood that tools must be kept ready for use, but they had remained silent in their leather for over a year. The valley was safe, defended by competent lawmen who understood the difference between justice and vengeance, order and oppression. Children grew up knowing that evil existed, but that good men and women stood ready to confront it with whatever force was necessary to preserve the civilization that allowed families to flourish. The legacy Tom had built through 4 decades of service continued through the men he had trained and the example he had set for future generations. Sheriff Martinez prepared to depart as darkness approached, lifting his son back into the saddle with the easy movements of a man comfortable with both his authority and his responsibilities. "Tom," he said quietly, his voice carrying the respect of a protege addressing his mentor, "the territorial governor has asked again about your accepting a federal commission. There are other valleys facing the same problems we solved here." Tom's pale eyes looked past the young sheriff toward the small cemetery where his beloved wife rested beneath the Montana soil, her memory still vivid enough to guide his decisions and provide comfort during moments of doubt. "Tell the governor I will consider any situation that truly requires my particular skills, Billy. But my traveling days are mostly behind me now. This valley, these people, this peaceful life I have finally earned, they represent everything I fought for during all those years of violence and uncertainty." As the sheriff rode away with his son, Tom Wade sat alone on his porch and watched the stars appear in the darkening Montana sky. His weathered hands no longer reached for his gun automatically when he heard unexpected sounds, and his sleep was undisturbed by the dreams of past violence that had haunted him during his first years of retirement. The Crimson Creek Gang had been the last criminal organization foolish enough to test his resolve, and their fate had sent a clear message to others who might consider similar enterprises. He rose slowly and walked inside his house, past the photograph of his wife that held the place of honor on the mantelpiece, past the glass case that displayed his Texas Ranger badge and the commendations he had earned through 4 decades of distinguished service. His Colt Peacemaker hung in its holster on a peg beside the door, ready for use, but no longer the defining element of his daily existence. Tom poured himself a small whiskey and raised the glass toward Martha's photograph, silently toasting the memory of a woman whose love had sustained him through 40 years of dangerous work and whose wisdom continued to guide his choices. The violence was finished now, replaced by the gentle routine of a man who had earned his peace through service to justice and protection of the innocent. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight, the valley slept safely under stars that shone down on a land where good men had triumphed over evil through courage, skill, and an unshakable commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves.